The dust motes danced in the stained glass light of Redemption Gulch's only church, each one a tiny silent witness to a dream turning to ash. Sarah May Connolly stood at the altar, a vision in her mother's lace, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. But the man beside her, William Prescott, the man who'd courted her with honeyed words and promises of a future as bright as a Montana summer, had just shattered her world with a whisper. He couldn't. He wouldn't. The gasps of the town filled the sudden terrible silence. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pierced through her. Just as the first sob escaped her lips, a voice, low and steady as the flow of the Yellowstone River, cut through the chaos. It was Clayton Munro, a man of few words and calloused hands, who stepped from the back pew. His gaze met hers, clear and unwavering. "If he won't have you, Miss Connolly," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the stunned church, "then I will. I'll treasure you forever." The church was sweltering. It wasn't just the late August sun beating down on the timber roof, but the collective body heat of nearly everyone who mattered in Redemption Gulch. They had all come to see the union of the valley's two most promising futures. Sarah May Connolly, daughter of the formidable cattle baron Patrick Connolly, and William Prescott, the charming, ambitious son of the town's most successful merchant. Sarah May felt a bead of sweat trace a path down her spine, hidden beneath the intricate lace of her mother's wedding gown. The dress was a legacy, a promise in itself. Her hand trembling slightly, and William's felt clammy. She'd chalked it up to nerves, the overwhelming emotion of the day she had dreamt of since she was a girl. William was the picture of a perfect groom. His tailored suit was the finest his father's store could procure from back east, and his blonde hair was slicked back, catching the light from the tall arched windows. He had whispered to her on the ride to the church how she was the most beautiful sight he'd ever seen, how their life together would be the envy of the territory. Reverend Michael cleared his throat, his voice a familiar, comforting rumble. "We are gathered here today, in the sight of God and these witnesses, to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Sarah May's heart swelled. She risked a glance at her father in the front pew. Patrick Connolly was a mountain of a man carved from the same rugged land he'd tamed. His face, usually a stony mask of authority, was softened with a rare, proud smile. He had approved of this match. William was educated, came from good stock, and had a head for business. It was a sensible, powerful alliance that would secure the Connolly ranch for generations. For Sarah May, it was more. She believed it was love. William Prescott, the Reverend, continued, "Do you take this woman, Sarah May Connolly, to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, to love and to cherish, forsaking all others as long as you both shall live?" The silence that followed was not the reverent pause of a man contemplating a sacred vow. It stretched thin and tight like a wire about to snap. Sarah May's stomach lurched. She squeezed William's hand, but it was limp, unresponsive. The whispers started at the back of the church, a low, sibilant hiss that grew into a confused murmur. "William," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He wouldn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the floorboards, his handsome face pale and slick with sweat. He swallowed hard, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating quiet. Son Reverend Michael prompted gently, his brow furrowed with concern. William finally lifted his head, but his eyes, when they met Sarah May's, were full of a desperate, panicked shame she had never seen before. I can't," he choked out the words, tearing from his throat. "Forgive me, Sarah May. I can't do this." The collective gasp of the congregation was like a physical blow. Sarah May felt the blood drain from her face. It was a nightmare, a cruel public spectacle. She could feel every eye in the church on her, 100 needles of pity and morbid curiosity. Her father was on his feet, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and rage. What is the meaning of this? Prescott, Patrick Connolly's voice, boomed, shaking the very foundations of the small church. But William was already backing away, stumbling like a man in a trance. "I'm sorry," he stammered again to no one in particular, before turning and fleeing down the aisle. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a gunshot, sealing her humiliation. The church erupted into chaos. Women were whispering behind their fans. Men were murmuring in shocked tones. Sarah May stood frozen at the altar, a statue of broken dreams in a borrowed lace gown. The bouquet of prairie roses slipped from her numb fingers and scattered on the floor. A single hot tear escaped and slid down her cheek, a traitorous signal of the utter devastation that was consuming her. Her perfect day, her promised future had evaporated in a puff of cowardice and shame. Just as the dam of her composure was about to break, a new sound cut through the din, the steady, deliberate tread of heavy boots on the wooden floor. From the back of the church, a figure emerged, moving with a quiet confidence that drew every eye. It was Clayton Monroe. Clay was a senior ranch hand for her father, a man who seemed to have been born of the earth itself. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-crinkled eyes the color of a stormy sky, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was usually a man of the background. His presence felt more than heard, his words few, but his actions always sure. He walked all the way up the aisle, his spurs making a soft, rhythmic jingle. He didn't look at the gossiping townsfolk or at her furious father. He looked only at her. He stopped before the altar, his gaze sweeping over her tear-streaked face with an expression of profound, aching gentleness. He bent down and picked up one of the fallen roses, his calloused fingers surprisingly delicate as he held it. Then he looked at Reverend Michael, his voice low, but carrying a weight that silenced the entire room. The vows were asked, Clay stated not as a question, but as a fact. The bride is here. It'd be a shame to waste the moment. Reverend Michael looked utterly bewildered. "Mr. Monroe, I don't understand." Clay's stormy eyes returned to Sarah May, and in their depths she saw something she had never noticed before, a fierce, protective loyalty that went beyond that of a simple ranch hand. "If he won't have you, Miss Connolly," he said, his voice clear and unwavering, "then I will. I'll treasure you forever." The church fell into a silence so complete you could have heard a pin drop. Sarah May stared at him, her mind reeling. Clayton Monroe, the quietest man on her father's ranch, had just offered to take the place of the man who had just destroyed her. It was madness. It was unthinkable. Yet as she looked into his steady eyes, she saw not pity, but a promise, a lifeline thrown into the ruin of her life. In that moment of absolute despair, it was the only thing she had to hold on to. Patrick Connolly recovered from his shock first. "Monroe," he roared, his voice cracking like a whip. "Have you lost your senses? Get out of this church. My daughter is not some prize to be claimed." Clay didn't flinch. He didn't even take his eyes off Sarah May. "With all due respect, Mr. Connolly," he said, his tone even and respectful, but unyielding. "Your daughter's honor is the prize, and it was just tossed in the dirt for this whole town to gawk at. What happens now? She becomes the girl left at the altar, the object of pity and whispers for the rest of her days. Or does she leave this church a married woman?" The brutal logic of his words struck Sarah May harder than William's abandonment. He was right. In their world, a woman's reputation was everything. William hadn't just broken her heart. He had branded her. She would be a pariah, a tragic figure in the town's folklore. Every social gathering, every trip to the general store would be an ordeal of averted eyes and hushed conversations. Her father seemed to grasp this too. The righteous fury on his face warred with a sudden dawning horror. He looked at his daughter, truly looked at her, and saw not the confident bride of 10 minutes ago, but a fragile, broken woman on the verge of social ruin. "What are you proposing?" Patrick asked, his voice, now low and dangerous. "I'm proposing to keep my word," Clay replied simply. He turned his attention fully to Sarah May, his expression softening. "Miss Connolly." "Sarah, I meant what I said. This ain't pity. I've worked your father's land for 10 years. I've watched you grow up. I know your character. It's worth more than all the gold in these hills. William Prescott is a fool. Let me be the man who proves it." Sarah May's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and shame. Marry Clayton Monroe, a ranch hand, a man she barely knew beyond a polite good morning when she saw him in the stables. He was kind, she knew that, and respected by the other men. He had once saved a newborn calf during a blizzard, carrying it back to the barn on his own shoulders. He was decent. He was strong, but he wasn't part of her world, the world of business dinners and society dances she had been raised for. Then she looked past him at the faces in the pews. She saw Mrs. Gable, the town's worst gossip, her eyes wide with malicious glee. She saw Mr. Henderson, the banker, already looking at her father with a hint of condescension. She saw her friends, her supposed friends, whispering to each other, their expressions a mixture of pity and excitement. Clay was offering her a shield, a strange, unexpected, and perhaps foolish shield, but a shield nonetheless. It was a marriage of convenience, a desperate act to salvage her name, nothing more. Her heart was a shattered ruin anyway. What did it matter who she was married to? Taking a shaky breath, she lifted her chin. The tears had stopped. A cold, hard resolve was settling in their place. She would not be broken. She would not be redemption, Gulch's cautionary tale. "Reverend," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "please proceed with the ceremony." A new wave of gasps swept the room. Reverend Michael looked from Sarah May to Clay, then to Patrick Connolly, who gave a single curt nod, his face a grim mask of resignation. The choice was made. The rest of the ceremony was a blur. Sarah May stood numbly as Clay took her hand. His was rough and calloused, engulfing hers completely, yet his touch was surprisingly gentle. She recited the vows she had memorized for another man, her voice a monotone echo in the cavernous silence. When Clay spoke, his vows, his voice, was a low, steady rumble, each word spoken with a conviction that sent a strange shiver down her spine. To love and to cherish, forever. He said it like he was sealing a sacred oath, not just repeating words. When the Reverend said, "You may kiss the bride," a moment of pure panic seized her. But Clay was understated in this, as in all things. He simply lifted her hand to his lips and brushed a soft, respectful kiss across her knuckles. It was a gesture of a knight to his queen, not a husband to his wife, and for that she was profoundly grateful. He led her down the aisle, his arm securely at her elbow. The townsfolk stared their faces, a gallery of shock and disbelief. Sarah May kept her head held high, focusing on the church doors, her escape. She did not look at anyone. Outside, the harsh sunlight was blinding. Clay led her not to the fancy carriage decorated with white ribbons that was meant for her and William, but to his own sturdy buckboard wagon, his horse a big roan named Dust Devil, waiting patiently. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice thin. "Back to the ranch," he said. "We'll use the old foreman's cabin. It's private. You'll need some space." He helped her up, onto the seat, his hands strong and sure at her waist. As he climbed up beside her, her father approached, his expression unreadable. Munro Patrick Connolly said, his voice heavy. "You've done a thing here today. I don't know if it's honorable or foolish, but you are now my son-in-law. You will treat her with the respect she is due. If you ever cause her a moment's pain, you will answer to me." "Is that understood perfectly?" Sir Clay answered, meeting his new father-in-law's gaze without wavering. "She's my wife. I'll protect her with my life." The journey back to the Connolly ranch was made in near total silence. The reality of her situation began to sink in. She was married. Married to Clayton Munro, a man whose life revolved around cattle, drives, mending fences, and the turning of the seasons. A man who smelled of leather earth and sweat, not the bay rum cologne William always wore. She looked down at her hands, still clutching the single prairie rose he had given her. The dream was dead. But as she glanced at the stoic profile of the man beside her, a man who had faced down public opinion and her father's wrath to save her name, she couldn't escape a terrifying, bewildering thought. A new, utterly unknown reality had just begun. The old foreman's cabin stood in a small grove of cottonwood trees by a meandering creek a mile or so from the main ranch house. It was a simple, sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a small porch. It had been empty for years. Clay had spent the afternoon while Sarah May had locked herself in her childhood bedroom, making the place habitable. He had swept out the dust and cobwebs, repaired a broken window pane, and started a fire in the hearth to chase away the musty chill. When he brought her there, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, the cabin was clean, and a pot of coffee was bubbling on the stove. It was a far cry from the opulent new home William had been building for them on the edge of town, but it was solid, real. The inside consisted of one large room with a stone fireplace at one end, a small kitchen area at the other, and a ladder leading to a sleeping loft. Clay had brought over a cot from the bunkhouse and set it up on the far side of the room, as far from the main bed as possible. A clean set of linens was folded neatly upon it. "The loft bed is yours," he said, not quite meeting her eyes as he gestured towards it. "It's more private. I'll take the cot. I'm sorry it's not much, but it's quiet here." Sarah May looked around the rustic space. The furniture was sparse and functional. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a worn armchair by the fire. It was the home of a bachelor, a working man. Her home. The thought was so alien, so jarring, that she had to grip the back of a chair to steady herself. "Thank you, Clayton," she said, her voice small. It felt strange to use his first name. He had always been Munro to her. "It's just Clay," he corrected her gently. He poured 2 cups of coffee into tin mugs and handed one to her. "I imagine you haven't eaten." She shook her head, taking the warm mug. The heat seeped into her cold hands. They sat at the small table in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the chirping of crickets outside. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was heavy with unspoken things, with the sheer, monumental weirdness of their situation. "Why did you do it, Clay?" She finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind all day. "You didn't have to. You could have lost your job. My father could have run you out of the county." He took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze directed at the fire. "I told you. I couldn't stand by and watch what was happening. It wasn't right, but to offer marriage to a woman you barely know." He finally turned to look at her, and his stormy eyes were serious. I know more than you think, Sarah. I've seen you manage the household accounts for your father when his bookkeeper was ill. I saw you sit up all night with the sick foal last spring, the one the vet had given up on. I saw you teach little Timmy the cook's boy how to read because he couldn't go to school. I know your heart is good and your spirit is strong. That's the kind of woman a man would be proud to have as his wife. Sarah May was stunned into silence. He had seen all that he had been watching, paying attention, while she had barely registered his existence beyond his role on the ranch. It was a humbling, disquieting realization. The first few weeks of their marriage were a study in awkward choreography. They moved around each other in the small cabin with a careful, deliberate distance. They were polite strangers sharing a roof. Clay was gone from before dawn until after dusk, working on the ranch. He never came back to the cabin for the midday meal, choosing to eat with the other hands. He was trying to give her space to make their arrangement as painless as possible. Sarah May, for her part, tried to make the cabin a home. She scrubbed the floors until they shone, aired out the musty linens, and even planted a small herb garden by the door. She learned the quirks of the wood-burning stove and began to cook proper meals. At first it was a way to pass the time, to fight off the crushing weight of her new reality, but slowly it became something more. The simple physical work was grounding. It left her too tired at night to lie awake, replaying her humiliation at the altar. Every evening they would eat dinner together at the small table. Their conversations were stilted, at first limited to practicalities, the weather, the price of cattle, a fence that needed mending. But gradually, Sarah May began to ask him about his work, and Clay, though a man of few words, would describe the day's events in his slow, deliberate way. She learned about the complexities of a cattle drive, the signs of a coming storm, the distinct personalities of the horses in the stable. One evening he came home with his left arm wrapped in a blood-stained cloth. A young steer had gored him while he was branding. Sarah May's training in basic first aid, something her mother had insisted upon, kicked in. She ordered him to sit her voice firm and gently unwrapped the wound. It was a nasty gash, deep and angry-looking. Without a word, she cleaned it with carbolic soap and hot water, stitched it closed with a fine needle and thread from her sewing kit, and bandaged it tightly with clean linen. Clay sat perfectly still the entire time, his jaw tight, but he never made a sound. His eyes followed her every movement. When she was done, she looked up and found him staring at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. It was nothing, she replied, flustered, turning away to put her things away. It wasn't nothing, he said quietly to her back. No one's tended to me like that in a long, long time. Later that night, as she lay in the loft bed, listening to the sound of his soft breathing from the cot below, she realized that for the first time since her wedding day, she hadn't thought about William Prescott at all. Her mind had been filled only with the feel of Clay's warm skin beneath her fingers and the startling intensity in his gaze. The house might not feel like a home yet, but for the first time, it felt like it could be. The town of Redemption Gulch didn't forget. Sarah May's first trip into town with Clay felt like walking a gauntlet. They needed supplies, a simple necessity that turned into a public trial. As they walked down the main street, conversations ceased. Heads turned. She could feel the stares on her back, a physical weight of judgment and curiosity. Mrs. Gable, holding court outside the mercantile, actually stopped mid-sentence and stared, her mouth agape. Inside the store, Mr. Prescott Williams' father refused to meet her eyes, his face a mask of sour disapproval as he tallied up their purchases. It was Clay who handled the transaction, his demeanor calm and unbothered, his presence a silent wall between Sarah May and the town's prying eyes. He paid in cash his movements economical and sure, and then guided her out of the store with a firm hand on her elbow. He didn't say a word about the whispers or the stares, a tacit understanding that to acknowledge them would be to give them power. But the isolation gnawed at her. The women she had grown up with, the ones who had been her bridesmaids, now offered only tight, pitying smiles if they crossed paths at all. Her life had shrunk to the boundaries of the ranch and the four walls of the foreman's cabin. One afternoon, about a month into their marriage, she was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when a rider approached. Her heart leaped into her throat when she recognized the horse. It was William Prescott. He dismounted slowly, looking haggard and thin. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a hunted, desperate air. "Sarah May," he said, his voice strained. He took a step forward, but she instinctively took a step back. "What do you want, William?" she asked, her voice cold. All the pain and humiliation of that day came rushing back. "I had to see you. I had to explain," he said, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. But you need to know it wasn't because of you. Wasn't because of me," she repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her. "You left me standing at the altar in front of the entire town. It felt very much because of me." "No," he insisted, his eyes darting around nervously, as if he expected to be overheard. "It was because of him. Elias Kane." The name sent a chill down Sarah May's spine. Elias Kane was a name spoken in hushed tones in the valley. He was a land speculator from Chicago, a man with deep pockets and a reputation for ruthless acquisition. He had been buying up smaller, struggling ranches south of their property for the past year, but he was more shadow than man, rarely seen in town. "What does Elias Kane have to do with this?" Sarah May demanded. William took a deep breath. "My father's business. It wasn't doing as well as everyone thought. He took a loan from Kane a year ago. A very large loan. We couldn't pay it back. Kane didn't want the money. He wanted influence. He wanted the Connolly Ranch." The pieces started to click into place in Sarah May's mind. "He wanted you to marry me," she stated, her voice flat. William nodded miserably. "He knew your father would never sell. But with me as his son-in-law, Kane would have a way in. He saw me as his puppet. He planned to ruin your father from the inside, using my position in the family to gain information, to create opportunities." "So what changed?" she asked, her heart growing cold. "Why leave me at the altar? Because your father is smarter than Kane gave him credit for," William said. 2 days before the wedding, your father announced he was signing a new water rights agreement with the government, securing exclusive access to the Blue Creek Aquifer for the next 50 years. He was protecting his land, making it self-sufficient, drought-proof. Kane's plan relied on being able to control the water downstream. Suddenly, the Connolly Ranch wasn't a prize to be won through marriage anymore. It was an obstacle to be destroyed. Kane saw our marriage as a liability. He told me if I went through with it, he would not only ruin my father, but he would see to it that I had an accident. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a pathetic mixture of fear and self-loathing. "I'm a coward, Sarah May. I know that. I should have told you. I should have told your father. But I was terrified. Kane is not a man to be crossed. He left me no choice." He turned to leave, then paused. "Be careful," he whispered. "Now that I'm out of the picture, Kane will find another way. He won't give up. And tell your husband. Tell Monroe to watch his back. Kane won't like that he stepped in and secured your father's legacy." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Sarah May standing by the flapping laundry, her world tilted on its axis once again. The man who had betrayed her was not a simple coward. He was a pawn in a much more dangerous game. And her marriage, the shield she had accepted out of desperation, was not a safe harbor at all. It had placed her and Clay directly in the path of a predator. That evening, when Clay returned from the long day's work, she told him everything William had said. He listened intently, his face growing harder and more grim with every word. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, staring into the fire. I knew Cain was trouble, he finally said, his voice a low growl. He's been having his men test our fence lines for weeks. Thought they were just opportunistic rustlers. He stood up and paced the small cabin. This changes things. This isn't just about the town's gossip anymore. This is about protecting this family. Protecting you. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his stormy eyes locking with hers. You're not alone in this, Sarah. He comes for this ranch. He comes through me. In that moment, the awkwardness that had defined their marriage dissolved, replaced by the grim reality of a shared threat. They were no longer just a jilted bride and a convenient groom. They were partners in a fight they hadn't chosen, and the foreman's cabin no longer felt like a house of strangers, but a fortress small and humble against a gathering storm. Elias Cain did not wait long to make his presence felt. He was a man who preferred to let his actions speak for him, and his actions were those of a circling wolf. The testing of the fence lines that Clay had mentioned escalated. One morning, a section of fence along the southern pasture was found cut, and 20 head of prime cattle were missing. Patrick Connolly was furious, but there was no proof of who had done it. A week later, the water in Blue Creek downstream from the Connolly property suddenly ran muddy and foul. Clay rode the length of the creek on their land and found the source a dead and bloated cow had been dragged into a narrow part of the stream just beyond their property line. It was a clear act of sabotage, meant to poison the water for the smaller ranches Cain was trying to squeeze out, a deliberate attempt to frame the Connollys and turn their neighbors against them. Clay and a few loyal hands, including a seasoned tracker named Gus, worked for 2 days to clear the creek and prove the sabotage had occurred off their land, but the damage to their reputation was already done. Whispers started in town that Patrick Connolly was using his new water rights to bully his neighbors. Elias Cain himself finally made an appearance. He rode up to the main house one afternoon, flanked by 2 hard-faced men who looked more like city thugs than cowboys. He was a stark contrast to the rugged landscape, impeccably dressed in a dark tailored suit with pale manicured hands and cold reptilian eyes. He didn't ask to see Patrick. He asked for the new Mrs. Monroe. Sarah May was in the main house, helping her father with the ledgers when Cain arrived. Her father intercepted him on the porch, his body language that of a bull defending his territory. "Cain," Patrick growled, "you're not welcome on my land." Cain smiled, a thin, humorless stretching of his lips. "Just a neighborly visit, Connolly. I came to offer my condolences to your daughter. Such a tragic turn of events at her wedding. And then to be so hastily married off to one of your hired men. It must be terribly distressing for her." His words were poison-tipped darts, aimed to humiliate. Before her father could erupt, Sarah May stepped onto the porch. She would not hide. She would not let this man think he intimidated her. "Mr. Cain," she said, her voice steady and cool. "My marriage is my concern. I am perfectly happy, though I thank you for your feigned sympathy." Cain's cold eyes appraised her, a flicker of something like surprise in their depths. "Feisty. I can see the Connolly spirit in you. A shame it's wasted on a common laborer. A woman of your standing should have more. I could offer you more. My associates in Chicago have a great appreciation for culture, for society." It was a veiled, insulting proposition, and Clay, who had been alerted to Kane's arrival and was approaching from the stables, heard every word. He didn't run or shout. He simply walked up the porch steps, his presence suddenly immense. He placed himself slightly in front of Sarah May, a silent, immovable barrier. "My wife has everything she needs," Clay said, his voice dangerously quiet. Kane looked Clay up and down with dismissive contempt. Ah, the hero of the hour. The ranch hand playing lord of the manor. "Tell me, Monroe, how does it feel to wear another man's shoes?" "These are my own boots," Clay answered, his gaze like flint. "And this is my wife you're speaking to. I suggest you choose your next words carefully." The two men who flanked Kane shifted their hands, moving subtly closer to the pistols at their hips. But Clay didn't even glance at them. His focus was entirely on Kane. The air on the porch was thick with tension, a spark away from exploding into violence. Kane held his gaze for a long moment, then let out a short, dry laugh. "Very noble. But nobility doesn't put food on the table or stop a prairie fire. Your father-in-law is a dinosaur, Mrs. Monroe. His time is over. This valley is changing. He can either sell to me and retire with dignity, or I can bleed him dry acre by acre. The choice is his." He gave a mock tip of his hat. "A pleasure to finally meet you, Monroe." He turned and walked away, his men falling in step behind him. That night, the atmosphere in the small cabin was grim. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a face and a name. "He's trying to provoke us," Clay said, cleaning his rifle with meticulous, focused movements. "He wants us to make a mistake, to give the sheriff a reason to get involved on his side." "So what do we do?" Sarah May asked, wrapping her arms around herself. "We don't make mistakes," Clay said, his jaw set. "We get smarter. We get ready." From that day on, Clay became the ranch's unofficial head of security. He organized the ranch hands into patrols, setting up watch schedules for the fences and water sources. He rode the perimeter of the vast property every single day, his eyes missing nothing. A broken twig, an unusual track, a flock of birds startled from the brush. He was using skills Sarah May never knew. He possessed the instincts of a hunter, the strategy of a general. She in turn put her mind to work. She went through her father's ledgers with a fine-toothed comb, analyzing every expense, every contract. She found where they were vulnerable, where Kane could apply financial pressure. She suggested consolidating their herds, selling off the lower-quality stock to build up their cash reserves, and preparing their suppliers in town to secure their loyalty. Her father, initially resistant to taking advice from his daughter on matters of business, was quickly won over by the sharpness of her mind and the soundness of her logic. "You've got a better head for numbers than any man I've ever hired," he admitted one evening, a rare compliment that made her chest swell with pride. They were a team. Patrick Connolly, the indomitable patriarch, Sarah May, the sharp-witted strategist, and Clay, the watchful guardian. The pressure from Kane was immense, a constant grinding war of attrition, but instead of breaking them apart, it was forging them together, turning a family and a marriage of convenience into a formidable alliance. And in the quiet moments in the cabin, amidst the talk of patrols and finances, Sarah May found herself looking at her husband not just with respect, but with a burgeoning, undeniable admiration. The autumn chill began to settle over the valley, turning the leaves of the cottonwoods by the creek to a brilliant, defiant gold. The constant pressure from Elias Kane had become the new normal, a low-grade fever that never quite broke. There were small acts of sabotage, a spooked herd, a deliberately set grass fire that was quickly contained, but Clay's vigilance prevented any major disaster. The tension, however, was taking its toll, leaving everyone on edge. It was during this time that the space between Sarah May and Clay in the small cabin began to shrink both physically and emotionally. The careful distance they had once maintained was eroded by the necessity of their partnership. They would spend long evenings poring over maps of the ranch by the light of a kerosene lamp, their heads bent close together, his rough finger tracing a proposed patrol route, her hand pointing to a vulnerable pasture. She learned the landscape of his face, as well as she was learning the landscape of the ranch. The fine lines etched by the sun around his eyes, the small, pale scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his jaw would tighten when he was deep in thought. She learned the rhythms of his presence, the solid, reassuring sound of his boots on the porch at the end of a long day, the quiet way he would mend a piece of tack by the fire, his hands moving with an efficient grace that was mesmerizing to watch. One night, a fierce autumn storm rolled in the wind, howling like a banshee and rattling the window panes. A sudden deafening crack of thunder shook the cabin, and Sarah May, startled from a light sleep, let out a small cry. From the cot below, Clay's voice came instantly through the darkness, low and calm. "It's all right. Just the storm." "I know," she said, her voice betraying a tremor she couldn't hide. "I've never liked thunder." She heard the creak of the cot, and then his shadowy form was at the bottom of the loft ladder. "Can I get you anything? Some tea?" "No, I'm fine," she lied. He was silent for a moment. "When I was a boy," he said, his voice a soft rumble beneath the roar of the wind. "My mother used to say that thunder was just God moving the furniture around in heaven. A silly thing, I suppose, but it always made it seem less frightening." Sarah May smiled in the darkness. It was the first time he had ever volunteered a piece of his past, a glimpse into the life he'd lived before he was Monroe, the ranch hand. "That's a nice thought," she said softly. He didn't return to his cot immediately. He stood there in the dark, a silent guardian against the storm, until her breathing evened out, and she drifted back to sleep. The true turning point came a week later. Kane, growing bolder, orchestrated a stampede. One of his men fired a pistol near the large herd grazing in the west pasture, sending over 500 panicked steers thundering directly toward a deep rocky canyon. It was a calculated act of cruelty, designed to cost Patrick Connolly a fortune. Clay, who had been riding the fence line nearby, saw it happen. He galloped toward the cabin, his face grim. "Sarah, ride to the main house, and get your father and every man he can spare. I'm going to try and turn them." It was a suicidal plan. One man against 500 terrified animals. "You can't," she cried, grabbing his arm as he was about to remount Dust Devil. "You'll be killed. We'll lose half the herd if I don't try," he said, his eyes intense. "Go now." He rode off a lone figure, charging toward a wave of horns and hooves. Sarah May didn't hesitate. She rode like the wind to the ranch house, her heart pounding with a terror that had nothing to do with the financial loss, and everything to do with the man riding into the face of it. By the time her father had gathered the men, and they arrived at the canyon's edge, it was a scene of chaos. Dust choked the air, and the ground trembled with the thunder of the stampede. But Clay had done the impossible. Riding with breathtaking skill, he had managed to push himself to the head of the herd, firing his pistol into the air, yelling, using his body and his horse to slowly, painstakingly turn the lead steers away from the canyon's precipice. But his luck was running out. His horse, exhausted, stumbled. Clay was thrown landing hard on the rocky ground. He managed to roll out of the path of the main herd, but a trailing steer, wild-eyed with panic, lowered its head and charged directly at him. Sarah May screamed. Without thinking, she spurred her own horse forward, grabbing the heavy rifle from her father's saddle scabbard as she passed him. She had been a decent shot since she was a girl taught by her father to hunt. But this was different. The target was moving. The air was thick with dust, and the man she was trying to save was her husband. She reined in her horse, raised the rifle, took a fraction of a second to aim, and fired. The shot rang out sharp and clear, and the steer collapsed, not 10 feet from where Clay lay. Silence descended, broken only by the panting of horses and the lowing of the now slowing herd. The ranch hands stared in disbelief. Clay pushed himself up his arm, bleeding his face, bruised, and looked at her. His expression was one of raw, unguarded awe. She slid off her horse and ran to him. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her hands fluttering over him, checking for injuries. He caught her hand, his grip strong and sure. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He searched her face, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. The world seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of them in a bubble of charged silence. The pretense of their marriage, the convenience, the arrangement, it all burned away in that single shared moment of terror and relief. That evening, back in the cabin, after she had cleaned and bandaged the cut on his arm and the scrapes on his face, the atmosphere was different. The space between them was no longer empty, but filled with a powerful, unspoken current. He stood by the hearth, watching her. "You saved my life today," he said quietly. "You saved the herd." She countered, her voice soft. "You were incredibly brave." "I wasn't brave," he said, taking a step closer. "I was terrified, not of the stampede. I was terrified of leaving you to face Cain alone." He was standing in front of her now, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. He gently reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers brushing against her skin. The simple touch sent a jolt through her. "Sarah." He whispered her name, and it was a prayer. "From the first day I saw you, you were like the sun. Bright and warm and completely out of my reach. When I spoke up in that church, it wasn't just to save your honor. It was selfish. It was the only chance I'd ever have to be near you." Tears welled in her eyes as the truth of his decade-long silent devotion washed over her. The love she thought she'd had for William was a pale, flimsy thing compared to this deep, steadfast emotion radiating from the man before her. "Clay." She breathed her own feelings, finally breaking free. He didn't let her finish. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the chaste, respectful kiss on the hand he had given her at the altar. It was a kiss of desperation and longing, of gratitude and promise. It was a kiss that sealed not a contract, but a bond forged in the crucible of fear and fire. In the heart of their shared danger, they had found something true and real. Their marriage of convenience was over. This was the beginning of a marriage of the heart. The day of the stampede burned away the last vestiges of their marriage of convenience. In its crucible of fear and violence, a powerful and undeniable love was forged. The walls between Sarah May and Clay were gone, replaced by a fierce partnership that Elias Cain had unwittingly created. The quiet ranch hand and the jilted bride were now a unified force, and they knew that defending their land was no longer enough. The time had come to take the fight to their enemy. Their strategy was twofold, playing to each of their strengths. Sarah May, with her sharp intellect and methodical mind, waged a war of paper and ink. She spent days compiling a meticulous dossier, documenting every act of sabotage, every threat, every missing head of cattle. She wrote a detailed letter to the territorial marshal in Helena, outlining Cain's systematic campaign of terror, not just against her family, but against the entire valley. She sent another more narrative account to an influential journalist in Cheyenne, known for exposing the corrupt practices of land barons. She was building a cage of facts from which Kane could not escape. Clay's approach was more direct. He needed a weapon that lawmen understood: a confession. Knowing William Prescott was the key, he rode out one evening, his destination a secret to all but his wife. He found William in a smoky, run-down saloon, 2 counties away, a man haunted by his own cowardice. Clay didn't waste time with pleasantries. He sat opposite him, his presence filling the small space with a grim intensity. "Kane tried to have me killed," Clay stated, his voice low and hard. "He stampeded 500 head of cattle straight at me. Sarah May had to shoot a steer to save my life." William flinched, the color draining from his face. "He's not going to stop." Clay continued, his eyes like chips of granite. "He'll destroy her family, and when he's done, what do you think he'll do with you, Billy, the one man who knows all his secrets? You're a loose end he will eventually cut." That raw, primal fear was the catalyst Clay needed. He slid a piece of paper and a pen across the table. "Give me a sworn affidavit. Everything you told Sarah May. Every detail of Kane's plan. You give me that, and I'll give you my word. You'll have a chance to disappear before the marshal comes looking." Fueled by a cocktail of terror and a desperate flickering desire for redemption, William Prescott wrote his confession. Armed with this new ammunition, Clay and Sarah May felt a shift in the power dynamic. But Kane, sensing the net tightening around him, grew desperate. His schemes had failed to break the Connollys. They had only made them stronger. With his options dwindling, he made a final, reckless move. He decided to steal their most precious asset. He and his 2 thugs ambushed Sarah May on her way back from town. The attack was swift and brutal. They dragged her from her buggy and took her to an old abandoned line shack deep in the Badlands, a property Kane had acquired through threats. His demand arrived at the Connolly Ranch an hour later, via a terrified young boy, the deed to the ranch signed and delivered by midnight in exchange for Sarah May's life. When his wife didn't return, Clay felt a cold certainty in his gut. The ransom note only confirmed it. There was no panic, only a terrifying, focused rage. Within minutes, Patrick Connolly, the tracker, Gus, and 10 of their most loyal ranch hands were armed and mounted. This was not a rescue mission. It was an execution. Gus, the old tracker, read the wagon tracks as easily as a page in a book. They rode hard and fast, the setting sun casting long, vengeful shadows before them. They reached the area around the shack as darkness fell, dismounting to approach on foot, silent as ghosts. Clay crept to the shack's grimy window. Inside, he saw Sarah May, bound to a chair, but with her head held high, her eyes flashing with defiance. Kane was pacing before her, his composure finally fraying. "Your father will sign," Kane was sneering. "He'll trade his precious dirt for his daughter, and your ranch hand husband can do nothing to stop it. My husband will find you." Sarah May's voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "And when he does, he will send you straight to hell." That was Clay's signal. With a powerful kick, he splintered the door and burst into the room, shotgun leveled. "It's over, Kane." Kane's thugs reacted instantly, but they were too slow. Coordinated gunfire erupted from the windows as Patrick and the ranch hands opened fire. One thug collapsed, the other diving for cover. In the chaos, Kane grabbed Sarah May, hauling her from the chair and using her as a human shield, pressing the cold barrel of a pistol to her temple. "Drop it, Monroe," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Drop it or I swear I'll kill her." The cabin fell into a tense, gunpowder-laced silence. Clay stood, frozen, his shotgun useless. He saw the wild terror in Kane's eyes and knew the man was desperate enough to pull the trigger. "Let her go," Clay said his voice, a low, commanding growl. "The marshal has your name. There's no way out." "I'll make a way out," Kane yelled, starting to drag Sarah May towards a back door. In that instant, as Kane shifted his weight, he exposed a sliver of his side. It was all Clay needed. In a single fluid motion, he dropped the shotgun and drew his Colt revolver. The speed was breathtaking. He fired once. The shot was perfect. The bullet tore through Kane's shoulder, and his gun arm went limp, the pistol clattering harmlessly to the floorboards. Sarah May slammed her elbow back into Kane's ribs and broke free. As Kane staggered, Patrick Connolly stormed in his massive frame, tackling the wounded man and pinning him to the ground. Clay didn't even glance at his defeated foe. He only had eyes for Sarah May, crossing the room in 2 long strides and pulling her into a desperate embrace. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair, the scent of her, the feel of her chasing away the icy fear that had gripped his heart. "You came for me," she whispered into his chest. "Always." He vowed, his voice thick with emotion. "I will always come for you." When Marshal Pike and his deputies arrived an hour later, they found Elias Kane and his remaining man tied and waiting. The reign of terror over Redemption Gulch was finally over. The shadow had been vanquished not by lawmen from a distant city, but by the unbreakable will of a family and the profound love of a man who had made a promise at a shattered altar and sealed it with a hero's courage. That's the story of Sarah May Connolly, and Clayton Monroe, a testament to the fact that sometimes our greatest heartbreaks are just setting the stage for our truest love. Theirs is a story that proves that honor isn't about reputation, but about action, and that real treasure isn't found in land or money, but in the steadfast heart of someone who sees you, chooses you, and promises to stand by you, no matter the cost. It's a reminder that even when a dream dies at the altar, a much more beautiful reality can be waiting just down the aisle. If this story of love, betrayal, and redemption in the Old West moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share it with someone who appreciates a tale of true grit and unexpected love, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We have so many more stories like this to share tales of the frontier, of the brave men and women who carved a life from the wild and of the timeless struggles of the human heart. Thank you for listening.